Evening all. This video is the third part of a trilogy which I call Hubris, where I look at the lives and deaths of three people who kind of regarded as footnotes to history, but nonetheless I think interesting. Their stories are interesting, and the circumstances that lead to their tragic demises, I think we can learn many lessons from them. So in the first video, it was about the yachtsman Donald Crowhurst, who entered a round the world yacht race, realized he couldn't complete the race, and for various reasons he felt compelled to fake his voyage, which ultimately led to him descending into madness and then killing himself. The second video looked at the Marxist academic Malcolm Caldwell, a man who became convinced that some of the worst communist dictatorships in the world, in particular Cambodia under the rule of the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot, that these were actually model societies. He travelled to Cambodia to essentially shill for the Khmer Rouge regime, got to meet Pol Pot, and Pol Pot had him murdered. And so the third part of this Hubris trilogy is about the post-war Japanese writer Yukio Mishima, and he really is a fascinating human being. To put this into context, how we would view him in the West, he had a status in Japan that would be akin to the status of Gore Vidal in the United States. Mishima also became famous worldwide, could speak 4 languages, gave lots of interviews in English and Japanese. So he was a major literary figure in post-war Japanese culture. But his life is full of, it's a theme I'm going to keep harking back to in this video, is duality. There's always seem to be 2 forces pulling him in different directions, and for a lot of his life he was able to reconcile that. He was able to acknowledge these dualities that were within him and what motivated him. Ultimately, it was keeping these forces in tension that led to his eventual death. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. So let's start with the beginnings of his life, which are in Japan in 1925 when he is born. Now, Japan at this time in history is, again, a clash of seemingly contradictions in the West, but in Japanese society, it was very organic to the culture. So Japan was in the 1920s was a modern industrialized nation, a leading country in the region. I think its power was only matched by the British Empire at its furthest extent, and also America. But in America in the 1920s, which is still, I would say at that stage, cautiously isolationist, but still with a colony in the Philippines. Also, technically speaking, at this stage, Hawaii is a colony. It's not yet a state. So Japan is a modern technological nation, but its government is a strange hybrid between an emperor who does take an active role in politics and leadership, a civilian government, and a military authority that has a lot of say in the government as well. But even then, the military is torn between the Navy and the Army for dominance at various stages. The Army and then the Navy and then back to the Army kind of win the struggle. But then they've got the civilian government to contend with and the emperor himself. So Mishima's born into this culture in 1925. But for the first 6 years of his life, he doesn't spend a lot of time with his parents. His grandmother is the most significant parental figure in his life, and she takes a very strange approach to raising him. She is convinced he is an unhealthily sickly boy that needs protecting from the outside world. He is a bit on the small side, always was throughout majority of his life until the 1960s, but again, I'm getting ahead of myself there. He is sheltered from playing with other children his own age, not allowed to go out much, not allowed to interact with the wider world. So she keeps him kind of contained and sheltered. At the age of 6, his father then becomes the primary parent. His mother really doesn't seem to appear in his biography that much, but his father certainly does, and gives Mishima the kind of the opposite education to what his grandmother's been giving him. So he is very keen that Mishima learns about Japanese history and culture, participates in it, has a kind of trained in kind of given a bit of a military education as well, growing up, especially once he gets into his teenage years. Mishima's introduced to the kind of the Japanese samurai code of Bushido, which was still very important in Japanese life and culture before World War II. When he becomes a teenager, he starts developing his writing skills. He's very talented as a writer very early on in his teenage years, and he starts writing on themes very much drawing on Japanese history and the martial culture, extolling its virtues, extolling its importance to Japan and to the concept of manliness. We might call it in the West the macho way. He extols the army. And this is at a time when Japan occupied large parts of China in 1931. Then in 1937, war breaks out between Japan and China, and Japan conquers a lot more Chinese territory. In 1939, Japan also gets involved briefly for like 3 months in a war with the Soviet Union. And up until this point, Japan's military prestige has increased. It's scoring victories against the Soviet Union and against China, two countries that have larger populations. But the Japanese martial spirit, they are fast proving to be one of the toughest armies and navies in the world. And also at this time, that build up to 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy expands, and you have the famous Kito Butai, the Japanese aircraft carrier force that did so much devastating damage to Pearl Harbor and Wake Island. So as Mishima becomes a teenager, he's spotted, his writing talents are spotted, and his work, because it's praising the Japanese martial spirit, his work gets published in popular literary magazines. He's attracting a lot of attention from academics and fellow writers. And, he's still in his mid to late teens at this point. He has an editor at one of these magazines who becomes his first homosexual lover. Now, I'm going to refer to this duality of Mishima a lot in this video. So, on the one hand, he's extolling these manly, macho, masculine qualities of martial combat and honor, but at the same time, he is a homosexual. And so this editor, the man's a bit older, not massively older, but a bit older, and that's Mishima's first lover. And under this chap's patronage, Mishima's work gets published more and he gets praised more. He starts flourishing in literary circles. Now, in 1943, his editor gets called up to serve in the Japanese military. And Mishima knows that within a year, he's going to be 18 and eligible for military service. So in 1944, he undergoes his first evaluation to see if he is fit enough to join the army or the navy. What happens is that his initial assessment by the examining board rates him as only second-rate soldier material, and this hurts Mishima. This crushes his soul, because he wants to be out there. He wants to prove that he has the proper samurai Kodo Bushido spirit, that he wants to go out into combat, fight, and perhaps die for his country. And he's rated second rate, which means he's probably going to end up with a desk job or a kind of support role, something, an auxiliary way in the rear, and he really doesn't want that kind of role in the army. He doesn't see that as particularly honorable. So he is hurt by that. And then he hears that his friend, his lover, the editor, has died. Basically, the editor had an argument with a superior officer, which led him to kill the superior officer before killing himself. And so Mishima's crushed by that as well. And he's also seeing in late 1944, early 1945, that the war is not going well for Japan. All this martial spirit that's being talked about, and they're losing. They're losing the war. And it sets off a dissonance in Mishima. Again, duality. Why are we such a potent fighting force, and yet we're still losing this war? Is there a problem with the leadership? Is the spirit, the samurai spirit, dying in the upper echelons of the officer corps? And his friend and lover's death kind of seems to symbolize this decline in the quality of Japanese leadership. So Mishima then has to go for a second evaluation, which is a more medical one. And when he goes, he's suffering from the symptoms of either a cold or the flu or some chest complaint, something like that. But Mishima, for whatever reason, and it's not made 100% clear, is that he decides to fake the symptoms of tuberculosis. So he takes this chest complaint that he has, bigs it up. He gets diagnosed with having tuberculosis and is therefore declared unfit for military service. Then what happens is that down the line, if the symptoms clear up, he may go back for a third evaluation to see if he needs to be called up. But then the war ends, and he's never called up, and he never gets the chance to serve in the Japanese military. And this, I think, is the defining moment in Mishima's life. This will govern a lot of what he does, a lot of what his attitude is, and right up to his last day on the earth. I think this is the inciting incident for the rest of his life, that he never gets to serve in the armed forces, and that when he had the chance to, he faked an illness to get out of it. I don't think that ever sits right with him for the rest of his life. So we're now into post-war Japan, occupied by America for a number of years before control to a civilian government is returned. And that civilian government is very different from the one before World War II. He's now democratically elected, still has the emperor. The emperor is in a ceremonial role, much like a European constitutional monarchy. And Japan repurposes itself. It stops being an aggressive, expansionist military power. It is now going to become a technological innovation, engineering world beater. It's decided it's going to repurpose itself to business and industry rather than martial pursuits. And what is a young man like Mishima, an idealist who holds the Japanese samurai spirit in such high esteem, what's he going to do? Well, he ends up by applying himself to his writing. And by the late 1940s, 1949, he has a best-selling book called Confessions of the Mask, which is a semi-autobiographical book. And he's only 24 at this stage, and he's written a semi-autobiographical book, but it's very revealing about how Mishima views the world and what he thinks the true Japanese spirit is. So he becomes a big hit by 1949, 1950. He's prolific. He keeps writing. every year. He's publishing more works. Finally, in 1956, he publishes a novel called The Temple of the Golden Pavilion, which gains international acclaim. This is an international bestseller, and it puts him on the world literary map. The book is based on a true incident that happened in 1950, where a man who, from a very poor background with a disability, takes offense. He has this kind of love-hate relationship with this real-life building called the Golden Pavilion, which is an elaborate geisha house, renowned for its architectural beauty in a beautiful landscape setting by a lake. And this poor, twisted young man decides it is an affront, and he's going to burn it down. He does burn it down. Golden Pavilion has since been rebuilt, but Mishima used that real-life incident as the basis of a novel, which became an international bestseller, put him on the world literary map. And again, it highlights a recurring theme in Mishima's work, which is beauty juxtaposed with violence. This is something that he is very, very interested in exploring in his literary work.